Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this final session of the afternoon. My name is Peter Monteith, and I welcome all of you to JLF Adelaide and to this banquet room venue. We're delighted to introduce the session titled Present Tense Way of the World with Peter Varghese, Shashi Tharoor, Tony Birch in conversation with James Crabtree to my immediate left here. Could you please ensure that your phones are on silent mode? We'd love you to tweet though using hashtag JLF Adelaide 2019 and do by all means tag our official social media pages at JLF Litfest and the details are on the large screen over there. So without any further ado, for now, I'm handing you over to the capable hands of James Crabtree.
Very good. Thank you very much. So there we go. Round of applause. What you should have been observing on stage while that introduction was being made is that if you are an Indian Member of Parliament and you ask for a cup of tea to be delivered on stage for when you start, things happen. So you should
not
all,
always in India, though.
you should all be noting the power balance on the stage here. So thank you very much. This session is called Present Tense Way of the World, and so what we're going to do for the next hour, 45 minutes with the panelists and then 15 minutes for your questions, is have a broad discussion about the intersection of global change and identity. How can we describe some of the big picture changes that are happening in Asia with a particular focus on India and Australia? And how is that affecting our sense of ourselves as people? And how, in a sense, are changing identities affecting the state of the world? And we're also going to talk a little bit about how that is going to be changed by a changing climate. And so to pick this through, we have on the far left of the panel Peter Varghese, presently Chancellor of the University of Queensland, but an ideal person to have on this panel given he had a storied career in the Australian Foreign and Diplomatic Service, including recently writing a long-term review of the relationship between Australia and India and being based in Delhi for a good period of time. Shashi Tharoor, purveyor of tea delivery, Indian parliamentarian.
Recipient, not purveyor.
Recipient, that's right. Modi's the purveyor, yes, of course. Indian parliamentarian, polymath, irritatingly prolific author, and general intellectual powerhouse. And in between them, representing the home authors team, Tony Birch, author of the excellent new book, The White Girl, which you can buy outside, and Ghost River, amongst others, and also working on climate justice at Victoria University. So let's start with the very big picture. If we're talking about changes in the changing world in Asia, Peter, can you, given you are a geopolitical analyst, can you sort of sketch out for us what you see are these significant changes that are occurring around Asia that are having an effect on the way that people see themselves?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, James. And Shashi, it must be pretty good to have an Indian parliamentarian and delivery bracketed in the one sentence. So.
Oh, thank you. God, this is starting off rather nasty.
So when I look out on the global outlook, if I can steal or adapt a phrase from Tom Wolfe, I think we're facing a bonfire of certainties because so much of the world that we became accustomed to after the Second World War is disappearing. And in many ways, the last 4 decades for a country like Australia, and I think this applies more generally, have really been our salad days because we have had a combination of strategic stability and economic growth, which is now looking a very unlikely combination into the future. We are, I think, close to a tipping point in terms of the currents of geostrategy. I think there are a number of strands to that. The first is that the so-called rules-based system or the multilateral system, really a creation of American leadership in the post-Second World War world, is under severe strain and arguably is on life support, not helped by the fact that the architects of the system are now led by an administration which shows no real interest in it, and in fact, in many ways, sees it as contrary to a campaign to put America first. Secondly, we are seeing now the development of an intense geopolitical struggle at the heart of global geostrategy between the United States and China. And this reflects two irreconcilable strategic ambitions. The United States is determined to hold on to its position as the predominant strategic power globally as well as in this part of the world. And China is determined to become the predominant strategic power, at the very least in the Indo-Pacific and possibly beyond that. And so how this geostrategic tension is going to be managed and where it places countries like Australia and India and many others is going to take a long time, I think, to work through the system. And then the third element that I would emphasize is that all of this is happening at a time when we're moving towards a much more multipolar geopolitical environment. In Asia, unusually at the moment, we are seeing a number of strong Asian countries who are becoming stronger at the same time. And you've got to go back quite a long way in history before you have seen that. So if you take all of that together, I think this is going to be a very uncertain period. And in the background of all of this is an international trading system which is becoming weaker, and therefore economic growth is slowing. For the last couple of decades, trade ran at 3 to 4 times the growth rate of the global economy, and now, of course, trade is slowing very considerably. You've got the rise of protectionism, you've got the rise of populism and a different type of nationalism. So the final observation I would make is that the last couple of decades has really been an economic narrative, an economic story, and by and large a successful one. The next couple of decades is going to be a political economy story, and the way in which politics and economics come together or don't come together is going to be decisive in many of our countries. Regrettably, in my view, what that means is we're moving into a stage where bad policy is good politics.
So, there we are. You're a generous audience. Shashi, could I ask you to sort of pick those themes up and give your sense of the big picture of the changing dynamics of Asia, and in particular how India fits into this? So you, Shashi, as I said, has written many books. One of them, written the best part of a decade ago, was called Pax Indica, about India's view of the world, and I know that it's a little longer ago now, but maybe you could give us the sense of how this looks from India.
Actually, I'm just so delighted that Peter has delivered a perfect summary of my forthcoming book.
Which I might point out is likely to be one of 3 that Shashi will release next year.
This one is due in January, and it's called The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. So Peter has done the New World Disorder part perfectly. I couldn't have put it better. These are precisely the analyses we make. I say we because there's a co-author involved, Samir Saran of the Observer Research Foundation. And the only thing is, at the end, we do talk about the potential for India to make a worthwhile contribution to this New World Disorder and help get it back in order. So on the big picture, I think Peter's absolutely right. I think we are seeing America in retreat. We're seeing it getting more protectionist, the trade wars being an example of that. We're seeing 2 currents of backlash against the globalization that seized the world between about 1980 and 2008. And the first backlash is clearly an economic backlash, particularly in the developed countries. People who see their jobs or the jobs they grew up expecting to take over from their parents suddenly being exported to Shanghai. And there is an understandable backlash against that. But there's also a cultural backlash, which we see most vividly in Western Europe and is exemplified by Brexit. The sudden waking up to a more cosmopolitan world in which you have a lot of foreigners amidst you and speaking other languages and looking very different. And some people have pushed back against that. And in that tumult, you've also got, as Peter rightly pointed out, an increasing protectionism. The very countries that sold the likes of us on the virtues of more trade, less impermeable borders, more transactions across geopolitical lines, those very countries are now turning more protectionist, are trying to protect their jobs, are trying to conduct trade wars, all of that. So everything that Peter says is right. The cultural backlash and the economic backlash sometimes go together and sometimes don't. So part of this cultural backlash has been a reassertion of nativism, of populist nationalisms in many countries by people who claim to be the more authentic representatives of the essence of their nations. And these include people like Trump with his Make America Great Again, which really the subtitle was Make America White Again. It's not going to happen, but that was part of his appeal. But you also have people like Erdogan in Turkey and Modi in India who have ridden the crest of this anti-cosmopolitan message in their domestic politics, but who don't want to expel Davos man, they want to be Davos man. And they're still, therefore, not part of the economic backlash, but are part of the cultural backlash. Now, in the midst of all of this, where should India go? Well, in Pax Indica, which is available here, India and the World of the 21st Century, published in 2012.
Very reasonably priced.
Very reasonably priced. But not very many copies are lost. So we don't need to expend too much energy on commercial time. But the fact is that I argued a case for India to do much more. I mean, the fact is, for the longest time after the Second World War, while the international institutions that Peter was saying are collapsing were being set up, India was a rule taker, not a rule maker on the global stage. And as India and many other countries in the developing world emerging into independence after the Second World War realized, you need a place at the table if you want to make a difference and protect your interests. Because in international affairs and global geopolitics, you're either at the table or on the menu. And some of us have felt we've been on the menu for long enough. And Pax Indica was part of, or perhaps an isolated example of, an argument that India has a great deal to offer in crafting a new world order in which there will be more multipolarity, as Peter mentioned, where we would have a more constructive and more egalitarian multilateralism, not going from the Cold War's bipolarity to the brief unipolar moment of the 90s and the early part of the first few years of the century, and then to some sort of G2 condominium between America and China, as some around Hillary Clinton had fantasized a few years ago. That's not the kind of world that anybody in the developing world wants to see. We want to see one in which everyone's voice can be heard. And I argue that India has the capacity, the resources, the human resources, as well as the technological skills and the means to actually make a difference in a whole lot of issues, from cyberspace to outer space, in which India has developed a significant credibility in world affairs and can help write the rules for all of that. My thesis wasn't taken up by anybody, so that's neither here nor there. But it's still relevant, and I've returned to it through the prism of the New World Disorder in the new book, in which I do argue that India should stop punching below its weight, as it has been doing in international affairs, and should take the opportunity to actually make a real difference in the world.
So I want to tease out in particular this issue of the second backlash, the cultural backlash and anxiety that manifests itself through these huge political changes, the rise of China, the decline of the West, the relative rise of India. And I suppose, could I turn to you, Tony, on this. And I mean, I know that your most recent book deals with themes of Aboriginal and Indigenous justice. But before we get to that, could you give us a sense, simply as an Australian, as how these big picture changes are changing Australia's sense of itself as a country that has an Anglo-Saxon heritage but sees itself increasingly as an Asian nation?
Well, firstly, I'd want to say I've never felt more out of my depth than I do now. I'm glad my mum's not here. If my mother was here, she'd be going, oh no, he's going to, she'd get so embarrassed for me. But what I think, I mean, I want to talk about the being part of Asia issue by telling a story, but one of the things that I think is interesting about, I think the regressive nativism of the present Australian government, and even in its relationship to Indigenous people, is that what governments like Australia don't understand, and their insularity doesn't understand the dynamic internationalism that's going on amongst, say, Indigenous communities. So one of the things that we know that have changed for the better with social media, where Indigenous nations and groups around the world, for instance, can't get traction from the national governments because of that regressiveness, they're making great alliances and compacts with other Indigenous nations and groups around the world. So I would say in Australia, a lot of Aboriginal people who want to get stuff done in regard to, say, climate, which is one of my interests, is that the connections that Aboriginal communities are making with Aboriginal and Indigenous groups around the world is really dynamic, so we forget that. I suppose the issue you ask about being part of Asia, I could say so many things about where we're at now. And again, thinking about climate justice, we have a government that panics and acts, in my view, in a very cruel way towards people wanting to come to this country or needing to flee to this country in relatively very low numbers when we consider the refugee situation around the world. And if anyone who works on climate justice got to speak to the Prime Minister, one thing we'd say, well, in a very short time, in a sort of relative time of human history, there are going to be hundreds of thousands and many millions of people who are going to need a home, whether it be in a temporary nature or a permanent nature. And if we're a country who can't cope with a few thousand people wanting a home, how are we going to cope with those numbers? Because we can't turn away boats. We have to engage with the world. We're not an isolationist society any longer. I think what the problem is for Australia historically is we've never understood who we are in that sense. So not only thinking about our relationship with ourselves as Aboriginal people and a colonial society, the Australian Anglo society has never really understood itself in relationship to Asia, and any decisions that are made are often, of course, economic or political decisions. I'm much more interested in what I would call the sort of the human aspect, the story of who we are. And I did talk about this out the back, but it's always frustrated me that my great-grandfather, who came from the Punjab in the 1890s, he was here before Australia was born. There was no Australia in the 1890s. There were a series of colonies owned by the British. And because of Federation and the Immigration Act, the White Australia policy, when my great-grandfather wanted to take my great-grandmother back to the Punjab and introduce his children, his Australian-born children, to his family, he had to go through a humiliating process of what was called the Exemption Act, so that when he came back to the newly born Australia, which was a very infant country, he would not be stopped at the door as most other people of colour were. And the point I want to make there is that he came back to Australia. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother had 5 children. They had children, and my great-aunts and uncles are part of that. I'm part of that community. So that all over Australia, the replication of that experience is of a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, which we still have governments trying to, in a sense, catch up with. So when we think about multiculturalism in Australia, we think about it as a government policy, whereas we who lived that, and in growing up in the inner city of Melbourne, it wasn't a policy, it was the culture of Australia. So we need to give more credibility to who we are than who we think we are. And the notion of who we think we are is very different and I think very narrow. And we have to overcome that.
That's interesting. I mean, Peter, could I bring you in on this? It's often said, thank you. More rounds of applause are good. It's often said in the context of the Brexit debate in Britain that there are only two kinds of countries in Europe. There are small countries and there are countries that haven't realized yet that they are small. I presume, in a sense, there must be a similar process going on in Australia as, in a sense, the reality of the new Asia emerges and the great beasts of China and India begin to take their rightful place, and this must do something quite profound to Australia's sense of national identity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can overdo the extent to which this debate about national identity is going to shape the way in which we position ourselves, in the region and beyond. I mean, I think Australia, even though we use the language of multiculturalism, is at its core a very assimilationist culture. And I think Indigenous culture has understood that to its detriment for a very long time. And it remains, if you like, the centre of gravity of the way in which Australia thinks of its success as a multicultural society, namely that we welcome people from all over the world, but there is a very clear expectation that in coming to Australia, they will assimilate into the mainstream of Australian culture, however defined. I don't see that shifting very significantly over time, and I think this debate that we have had on and off about whether we're part of Asia or not part of Asia, in some ways is a bit of a dead-end debate in my view. Australia has to come to grips with the fact that in relative terms, our weight in the Asian region is in some respects going to diminish. 10 years ago, we could say that the Australian economy was bigger than all of the economies of Southeast Asia put together. Today, if you use purchasing power parity as a measure, the Indonesian economy is already bigger than the Australian economy. So we are going to have to adapt to a world in which the influence of Asian countries, whether they're the big Asian countries like China and India, but also the countries of Southeast Asia, is only going to grow. And that means we're going to have to be much more nimble in the way in which we deal with those relationships. And we're going to have to learn, I think, more adeptly to play to our strengths. And some of our strengths will flow from this combination of Australia as an inheritor of Western institutions, but also as a country whose primary strategic and economic interests are going to be most pursued in a broadly Asian or Indo-Pacific environment. And can I just make one other point, James, and that is a lot of this sort of cultural dissonance that we're seeing globally also has, in my view, a psychological dimension to it, which relate to the pace of change that all of us have experienced as we've moved towards a hyper-globalized economic system, and whether we move back from that into the future is a moot point. But there was a terrific book written quite some time ago by Erich Fromm called Fear of Freedom, which sought to explain why a country with the sophisticated culture that Germany had embraced Nazism as a political philosophy. And at the core of his argument was that there was a sense of displacement in the German psyche that was caused by the history leading up to the rise of Nazism. And I think there is a psychological equivalence of that we can see in many of our societies today, including in Australia, as our lives are changed and transformed by the push of technology and globalization.
So I want to get back to India, but I just wondered, Tony, if you wanted to, does what Peter said chime with your own sense of Australia's challenges and in a sense what that means for Australian multiculturalism and its history of tolerance?
Yeah, well, listening to Peter, I was thinking of what has become I might even say an intellectual or psychological obsession with me. And that is, again, thinking about who we really are rather than who we think we are or the way we like to project ourselves. I think when we consider how Australia will see itself in relationship to Asia or globally, we do have to reassess who we really are. And until we do that, what we have instead of that is what I, again, consider a fairly shallow and meaningless jingoism. So when recently Scott Morrison was at a Pacific Forum, he talked about the mateship between Australia and these Pacific nations, of which are currently facing a grave climate crisis of rising sea levels that is now, not in the future, and yet we have an Australian government refusing to have a proactive policy to deal with this, and basically said to the Pacific Island leaders, we're all mates, we're a part of the same family. It's meaningless and it's offensive. So I'm interested in tangibles that make us think about who we are. So I don't know if anyone saw in the last few days, there was a release of a new strategy by the National Australian Tourist Party, whatever the name they go under now, and they had 9 core values that we need to promote overseas about who we are, and they were cringeworthy for those jingoisms. So the fair go, tell someone on Manus Island you're getting a fair go. It's pretty horrific. So, but one of the things that I'm interested in is this does flow into my international interest on climate as well, because if you look at countries that have good climate policy, including a renewables policy, they have a much more holistic view of people. So countries that have good renewables policy often have good policies on maternity leave. They have good policies on unemployment. They have good laws to protect the elderly. So climate is not seen as a policy decision, it's seen as part of your society. So when I think about those core values of who we are and how we value ourselves, I think, well, how do we feel about the amount of money that we pay people to exist on Newstart? How do we feel about the fact that our elderly, who are now subject to this Royal Commission into the aged care, don't have any tangible legal rights ascribed to them because of their situation? So I think we need maybe immediate sort of shifts about who we are as a nation, but I'm also interested in, do we have the patience to have a generational shift philosophically and politically and emotionally about who we are? And I can't see I don't know a politician Peter might know people from his old job. I can't, this is something about Australia, and people could do their own test. I was at my daughter's house in London last year, and we said, okay, we're going to play a game. We can have any politician in Australia of any party, state or federal, and we will just let them become a Prime Minister. Don't worry about Bill Shorten or Scott Morrison. We'll pick someone of value, and we couldn't come up with anyone.
Maybe you can...
Yes. Yeah, Penny Wong. She came up. She did get a vote off my daughter, Penny Wong.
You can give Shashi a home. So.
But I suppose my point is that, and I'm sure there are people, but I think the value or the quality of politicians in Australia has reduced significantly. And I know it might be my side of politics, but if you look through the years of the Hawke-Keating administration, if they both had fallen over, I think there would have been half a dozen people in that Labor Party who could have stepped forward and be Prime Minister. I don't think you could possibly hope for that now in this country.
Let me just take the conversation back to India, given the 2 polls that we're having, and to pick up, in a sense, Shashi, the theme that Peter was talking about, the pace of change and the way in which these global economic geopolitical shifts are affecting our sense of identity. I mean, in one sense, you might think if you were a young Indian at the moment, you would be filled with an extraordinary sense of self-confidence. You know, think of what you're going to see over the next 50 years as your country accedes, as opposed to we in the declining West. And yet you have written kind of persuasively on the oddity of the Hindu nationalism that is taking hold of India under Modi, which on the one hand does express a certain kind of self-confidence and pride in India, but on the other is very anxious and angry and insecure about India's place in the world. And I wonder, could you, for those who perhaps are less familiar with this, give a kind of sense of how this issue of the pace of change and the anxiety it brings is playing out in India's dominant culture?
Absolutely. I mean, it's by the way, it's interesting that you've got all three panelists have had great-grandparents born in India, but only one of us actually lives there and is trying to make a go of it. So there's a challenge. But if you look at India today, in fact, I was very struck by Peter's comment about Eric Fromm's fear of freedom, because we've had, as you said, dizzying change. India has transformed itself dramatically in the 72 years since its independence. And in the last generation in particular, there's been the astonishingly rapid movement of IT and modern communications, a once protectionist economy becoming much more globalized, dramatic changes in politics, in caste relations, in all sorts of phenomena that in other societies could even have triggered off a revolution, but in India somehow has been absorbed so far within the national consensus. Or so we thought. And then suddenly here we have, as of 2014, the rise of a party which has never subscribed to that national consensus, under a leader whose ideology is fundamentally different from what India has actually seen in office before. So, our nationalist movement did not divide on ideological lines. When we were fighting for freedom from the British, it wasn't that India, the nationalists, divided between Marxists and capitalists or liberals and socialists. It divided over a very simple principle. Should religion be the determinant of nationhood? And one set of people said, yes, it should be, and that was the idea of Pakistan, and they created a country in which one religion would dominate. And everybody else, led by Mahatma Gandhi, said, no, religion cannot determine our nationhood. Our nationhood embraces everybody. 3,000, 4,000 years of recorded Indian civilization. We've had all these great influences from around the world. Every religion has a home here. And we have fought for the freedom of all these people, and we will write a constitution to safeguard the equal rights of all these people. And this was the idea of India, and we celebrated it and lived it for 7 decades. And because we were a very contentious but thriving democracy, it was possible for people like me to stand up and say, look, we have differences of caste, of creed, of color, of culture, of consonant, of conviction, of costume and custom. But we still rally around a consensus. And that consensus was on the simple principle that in a country like India, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. Now that principle, those ground rules are for the first time being questioned by those in power. And they have a very different vision of India. They see this as a Hindu nation. They want to make it a Hindu Rashtra in their vocabulary. They are, in many ways, articulating an impatience with the inadequacy of democratic India to cope with the rapid forces of change you mentioned, James. And because it's convenient to find scapegoats for failures, or if not failures, at least disappointments in terms of earlier aspirations. My big worry with this lot in power is that you will see both a nativist reassertion of a quote-unquote authentically Hindu ethos in what has so far thrived as a diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, and that you will also see perhaps a dangerous willingness to dispense with elements of democracy. Dissent is already being delegitimized in many ways. There are various acid tests being promulgated by those in power. And as far as Hinduism is concerned, one of the reasons I wrote my book, Why I'm a Hindu, which is also published in Australia, is to
also
argue
available,
that,
very reasonable cost.
there you are, is to argue that the Hinduism in which I believe a majority of my co-religious have grown up, is not the Hindutva being preached by those in power in India today, the Hindu nationalism of Modian people. That as a very proud Hindu, I enjoyed the fact that ours was this extraordinary religion which did not claim to be the only true religion of the world, that had enormous amount of scope for individual variations of worship. We have no pope, we have no imams issuing fatwas, we have no single holy book but several, we have no, and we don't even have a Sunday, where every one of the 7 days of the week can be yours to pick and choose which gods you want to consecrate to and choose to worship.
But can I push
that
you?
kind of
can
faith,
I push you on that?
How does it lend itself to this? How can a religion without fundamentals lend itself to fundamentalism? But that's what the ruling elements are doing.
So powerful. So, I mean, this gets at a complicated issue, but so powerful has the upsurge in Hindu nationalist identity been that it has had a very negative effect on your current political party, the Congress. And it struck me that in writing your book about Hinduism, in a sense, you seem to be saying that it was almost no longer possible for a party like the Congress to be purely secular, that you had to articulate a moderate vision of Hinduism to balance out the crazy vision of Hinduism, or all was lost.
No, my argument was really that if you argue this issue in a deeply religious country as a debate between believing Hindus on the one hand and godless secularists on the other, the godless secularists were going to lose. Simply because secularism in India had never meant what it meant, say, in France. Instead of secularism being what your dictionary tells you it is, which is distancing yourself and the state and public life from religion, secularism in India actually meant the proliferation of religions. It was actually pluralism that the state was promoting. Secularism was the wrong word. It actually gave cash and subsidies and help to every religion in India. Subsidized the Hajj, subsidized a pilgrimage to the Mansarovar Lake in Tibet, all of the sort of stuff. Every faith was given help by the state. So India actually stood for a certain vision of pluralism, which is now being contested in the name of Hinduism as promoting a sort of uniformity rather than merely unity. In fact, uniformity, or the attempts to promote uniformity, could end up destroying unity, which is something that some people in power haven't been able to realize. So when I said what I said, I was saying, look, so far we've practiced Hinduism, as many of us Hindus in secular liberal parties have done, without making a show and tell of it, because it was just who we were in our private lives and nothing to do with our public life. But now that people have injected a distorted version of Hinduism into public life, we owe it to ourselves and to our faith to stand up and say, hey, we're Hindus too, but we're not that kind of Hindu. And that's why I wrote the book I did.
I mean, Peter, you lived in Delhi, you observe India closely. I mean, I wonder if you had thoughts on this, perhaps the extent to which nationalism in a country like India, potentially China as well, is a stabilizing or destabilizing force. I mean, what did you observe of the upsurge of the changing nature of nationalism in a country like India?
Well, I think nationalism can be both. It can be a stabilizing and a destabilizing force. I mean, I don't want to get into a commentary on the political debate in India across the political divide, but what I would say is that the secular, liberal, democratic character of India is absolutely fundamental to the ability of countries like Australia to develop a deep partnership with India. And if India were to significantly stray from that character, I think it would not just diminish India as a country and diminish the prospects for India, but it would make India a much less attractive strategic partner for Australia. And sitting behind that judgment is, I think, a sense that values and geopolitics are going to become much more closely entwined over the next little while. And you can see this in that US-China fault line, because ultimately for a country like Australia, what is it about China's strategic ambitions that make us uncomfortable? And if you think that through, it is the character of the Chinese system.
Exactly.
So what makes us uncomfortable is the idea that a liberal democracy in the United States, and notwithstanding its current wobbles, the United States is a liberal democracy, would be displaced by a one-party authoritarian system. And I think that's a deeply uncomfortable thought for Australia. I suspect it's a deeply uncomfortable thought for India, as it is for many other countries, including Japan. So to the extent that this is a debate or a struggle for the soul of India, it actually has consequences well beyond India's borders.
Tony, before we open it up to the audience, I mean, in a sense, we've been having a conversation about the way a couple of big macro changes are affecting our view of ourselves. One of those was economic globalization, and another was a combination of cultural globalization and people movement. But in a sense, while economic globalization is receding, you might think, or you may fear, that what is coming down the track with climate change and the climate crisis could end up having an even more profound and disruptive effect between winners and losers within countries, between nations. I mean, could you, as a rather pessimistic note on which to end our own part of the conversation, sketch out how you think this is going to work?
I'm very good at pessimism. Well, I think there's something clearly related to what's been said, and that is that when you think of, well, and Peter said, nationalism to the extent to what it could be positive or negative, but say in relationship to thinking about it as looking inward, which is happening, I think, around the globe. There's one issue, and that is that climate change can't be dealt with as a local issue. It has to be dealt with as a global, international issue. And one of the things we're finding at the moment is that countries are sort of being sort of defensive and nationalistic about why should we do anything? India's not doing enough, or China's not doing enough. So we're using our sense of who we are and a defensive view of the world, which creates inertia of people doing nothing. So the idea of self-interest doesn't fit with a global policy on climate change. It just doesn't fit. You can't have a self-interest. You must have a common interest. So that's a real challenge when you think of the way of Western democracies are functioning at the moment, let alone other countries. In response to that, and not to be too pessimistic, it's one of the reasons, though, rather than say, well, we can't do anything, which is what some countries say, you just have to get on and do stuff, whether you're doing it at a local level, whether you're linking up with other groups internationally, it's vital to do that. The other thing, and I'd point to a book called Slow Violence, Environmentalism and the Poor, by a guy called Rob Nixon. Rob Nixon makes I suppose the chilling point in some way is that rather than think of an apocalyptic narrative, the end of the world, which is not going to happen by 2050, as my daughter keeps telling me, and Brad Pitt is not going to come and rescue us in some sort of weird spaceship. What's going to happen in 2050 is that the world is going to change very much. It's going to change environmentally, ecologically, politically, and economically, all of those things. And if we don't find a way of dealing with this issue as a global community, people are going, what Nixon would say is, the world's not going to end, it's just going to be a much more difficult world to live in, and what will happen is the people who are now poor and marginalised will be more marginalised, will be poor and will suffer greatly. The whole notion we've got to be a bit careful of is when we say we're all in the same boat, in the sense we're all going to be affected by climate change, we are in the long term, but now we're talking about there are people who don't have boats. Some people have boats, some people don't have boats. Some people can shore up their defences for the next 50 years. The people who will suffer and are suffering now are people who are already people that we've pushed to the margins. People who are not white, people who are not Western. So unless we find a way to overcome our defensiveness and our insulation, the outcome for the global community is going to be catastrophic.
Very good. Right. So,
Sorry.
we said we'd end on we said we're going to open up for questions to add a note of optimism to the concluding thought of this. So I see one hand at the back and a woman here at the front. So can we have short questions, please?
Yes. Question to Peter. Since it seems to me, Peter, since 1947, Australia's had innumerable opportunities to develop what you call a deep strategic partnership with India. Why hasn't it happened?
Good question. And then the lady in the front. Let's take a couple at a time. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a question for Shashi. The Congress has sort of, the last, you project yourself as the last hope for a secular India. Why are you still with the old model of sticking with a dynasty? We really need to get rid of them. Why aren't there people like you at the fore?
All right. Gosh, you're not giving him an easy question, are you? So, come on, Shashi, why are you sticking around?
I think Peter got the first question.
Why are you sticking around, Shashi?
No, I'm sticking around, as I think James knows very well, because I'm not a career politician. I had a totally different life in the United Nations, and as a writer, I came in because I have certain beliefs and values and principles that I thought I needed a political platform to express and protect and promote in India. And the Congress Party remains the closest thing we have to a truly secular, liberal, democratic party in the country. And that's why I'm in it. There isn't a credible alternative other than regional parties or parties with a very small regional appeal, which would not be of interest to me because my perspective is national and international. That's why I'm in it. As to the leadership of the Congress Party, I mean, unfortunately or otherwise, most of our political parties actually tend to be dynastic. It's simply in the nature of the society. Unfortunately, the caste system comes out of this dynastic imperative. If you want to be a cobbler or a carpenter, you better have a dad or an uncle who's a cobbler or a carpenter, because nobody else is there to teach you. That's the way in which castes evolve through professional transition through the gene pool. So Bollywood stars' sons are Bollywood stars, and politicians' sons are politicians, unfortunately. Mine have no desire to be, but somehow it's there. I mean, mine are writers, which is probably just as bad, because there is that dynastic thing. So to cut a long story short, the Gandhis dominate the Congress Party because the party workers want it that way. And I think it's fair to say that if tomorrow any member of the Gandhi family contested against any other Congress leader you could care to name, he or she would win hands down in a fair and free poll amongst party workers. So do you look at the party and the values, what it stands for, and work for it, or do you look at other factors? For me, it was the values and principles that mattered the most.
Peter, do you want to take the issue of Australia and India?
Sure. So to develop a deep strategic partnership, you've got to have shared hard interests, which are mainly strategic and economic. The reason why we've never been able to do that with India until relatively recently is that we really lived in different strategic and economic universes for most of that period from 1947 through at least the early 1990s. I mean, India went down the non-aligned movement track. We were a paid-up member of the US alliance. India went down an economic self-sufficiency track, and we thought of ourselves as an open, globally trading economy. I think what has changed and what makes the prospect of a deep strategic partnership now much more bright is that we do have real congruence both on the strategic and the economic front. I mean, India is now a very different strategic player with a very different strategic policy to the old non-aligned days, and while its protectionist instincts, I think, are still pretty deeply entrenched, the overall narrative since the early 90s has been for an opening economy. So we can come together much more closely now than we ever could before. And then you've got this third element, which is the Indian diaspora in Australia, which in my view is going to be a very key gateway to building this relationship. So having 700,000 people of Indian origin in Australia, I know that's a number that means nothing to anyone in India, 700,000, but for us it's a serious number.
Yeah.
That's right. One out of every 5 Australians is born in India. Every 4 Australians is born in India.
Don't tell Pauline Hanson that, please.
All right.
I think you might be a zero off.
Yeah, I think
She came to India and was incredibly friendly.
I think the maths isn't quite working on this one. Let's take a few more questions. So did I see one here? Yeah.
Sorry, 1 out of every 25. It wasn't a 0, it was a 2.
That's right. There we go. Come on.
My question is for Peter, but for the panel as well. Peter, you said that Australia has an inherently assimilationistic culture. So, given that context, how is the Indian diaspora going to change and impact Australia over the next 50 years?
Very good. Small question. Go on. Sir, I saw a hand over here. Yeah, do you have a mic? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is highly illuminating.
Can you stand up so we can see you?
Yes, hi.
Thank you.
Shashi and Peter, I think it's a question more to you. I believe the first time around, the electorate could be fooled into believing that there are other reasons why they should look away from the values that we are celebrating in this room, and clearly people outside might not be caring much about it. We had another election in 2019. My question is, why are they not listening to you? And what does it tell about them?
Oh, Shashi's not getting some easy questions. Peter, why don't you continue on the theme of the Indian diaspora and give us a sense of how that's going to work here in Australia?
Yeah, well, look, I actually think the Indian diaspora will assimilate quite quickly into Australian culture. And if you look at the sort of attributes of the diaspora in terms of their employment, their education, their English language ability, the background from which they come, they will prove to be, in the Australian experience, a successful migrant community. And I think as a result, we'll probably see a growing Indian diaspora presence in many aspects of our public life, including down the track in our politics. In fact, in the report I did to the Prime Minister last year with a 20-year strategy for India, I made the somewhat tongue-in-cheek observation that the Indian diaspora political influence in Australia over the next 20 years will be bigger than any other migrant community apart from the Irish.
I mean, Tony, do you want to chime in on this? I mean, I wondered whether the rise of diaspora communities in Australia has been challenging to the identity of Indigenous people, but just in general, whether you had a view on
well, certainly not historically. I mean, the question is really important, but it throws up, I suppose, a frustration, firstly in relationship to historically, and it is in my novel. I have a character who's one of the supposed Afghan cameleers, as they were called. There is a really strong history of men in particular migrating from what became India to Australia and marrying into Aboriginal families. So we don't have any problems with people from India, as obviously evidenced in my family. And also that those families, which might surprise people, those families going back. So that there are people now, generations of people who grew up in India who part of their heritage is Aboriginal from Australia, which is migration going the other way. And I think that growing up in the cities, the notion of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, particularly from non-Anglo communities, has a wonderful history. I think the question is so important because, and Peter's response, when Peter said about being assimilated into, I suppose the professions and really important, influential professions in Australia, is what does assimilation mean? Is it the sense of what will they do with that? So that in regard to the Irish historically became really important political players in particularly, say, in Victoria, where I grew up. And my wish would be, and this is not to put too much responsibility on that diaspora, I would hope that those people from India who migrate to Australia and do become successful and influence, I would hope that they shift the tenor of who we are and actually be advocates for something more than a white Australia. Now, I wouldn't want to put that responsibility on an individual, but that's the sort of hope you have. So in reality, and so I come from Melbourne, there are many, many Indian communities who are mixing with, going to school with, kids working together and at universities, and you hope that has a positive impact and it makes change. Historically, sometimes that assimilation of new migrant groups has not achieved what we would hope in that sense of shifting the nation. So we're now 60, 70 years into the great post-war migration story, and it has changed Australian society in many ways for the positive. But again, from my view, at the moment, though, we have a narrow-minded government that sees us projecting an image of who we are in a redundant way. So it's quite complex and contradictory in that way. So I can't answer the question except to say it throws up real challenges.
Well, in some ways, James, it might even go further back than that, because there are some Australian Aboriginal communities that look to the naked eye like Tamils from India and Sri Lanka, very visibly so. And some linguists did some research about a decade ago that established 400 words in common between an Aboriginal language in this country and the Tamil language. So there's been something before recorded history where people seem to have moved.
Now that is an interesting digression, but I don't want to let you avoid.
Tony says it's true. There you are.
Avoid the question by
No,
the
I'm not
gentleman
avoiding
here.
the question.
So,
I mean,
so give us.
Why did we lose again?
We're
in
about
short?
out of time. Well, you can. Why did you lose again? But give us a sort of. This is a room that I think is. I would intuit rather well disposed towards your political project. So why don't you leave us with a little bit of hope for the future as to, even though you lost last time, why the idea of India in which you increased your majority.
So since the question was why didn't they listen to you, my voters listened to me and I increased my majority considerably, so I'm back in Parliament. But it is true, thank you, but it is true the party nationally did not do half as well or a third as well as we had expected we would in our worst case scenario. So we really got clobbered again in a way that none of us were expecting. Looking back on it, if I had to analyze the factors, it didn't help that there was a terrorist attack that killed 40 Indian paramilitary soldiers a month before the election, and that the government not only made a whole to-do about national security, which distracted people from its economic ineptitude, but it then conducted a retaliatory air raid on Pakistani territory, which they claimed had eliminated 300 terrorists, and the Pakistanis took journalists to show that all it had done was knock out a few trees on a deserted hillside. But the fact is the government's chest thumping and muscle flexing seems to have played very well in northern India. I'm a candidate from the south, and therefore this didn't have any impact there, and the BJP didn't do well in the south. But in the north, this certainly seems to have swung a lot of votes. The second factor, which is an interesting clue, the BJP, which came to power in 2014, Modi saying things like, the government has no business to be in business, and we must completely liberalize the economy, and deriding the welfareism and povertarianism and so on of Congress governments, discovered rapidly that votes lie with the poor, which has, of course, been an open secret of Indian economic policy since independence. We don't behave as politicians according to the wishes of the majority of taxpayers, because taxpayers are only 5% of our electorate. We represent a majority of people who live on less than $2 a day, so their votes matter. And what Modi did, particularly in his last year of his first term, as he was scrambling for credibility, was to deliver a lot of, for example, toilets to villages that didn't have toilets, gas cylinders to poor women cooking with wood and cow dung in unventilated kitchens in the villages, inexpensive light bulbs and so on. And we could have gotten onto that and actually challenged these. We could have pointed out that 65% of those toilets don't have running water, which is true. Some of them are just being used as storehouses. That the gas cylinders were all very well for a one-time deal, but 92% of the beneficiaries couldn't afford refills. So the entire scheme was just gesture politics, and so on and so forth. But instead of doing that, we kind of ignored that and focused on the macroeconomy, the fact that unemployment was at a 45-year high, the rupee was collapsing, exports were down, manufacturing was down, and agricultural distress is so severe that the government is for the first time now suppressing figures of farmer suicides because they've broken all records. So we thought this big picture. I myself thought, why would a young man who voted for this Modi expecting to get himself a job, still vote for Mr. Modi 5 years later when he doesn't have a job? Well, the answer is because he believes he's bought the line that this government can protect India better than anyone else against the insidious threats of our terrorist financing and supporting neighbor, and that's Pakistan, and that it actually has done something for the rural poor in northern India. And these two messages, I think, were driven home very effectively by an extremely well-organized and well-financed election campaign by the BJP. So if you ask me why did we lose again, these were the reasons we lost again. They weren't apparent entirely during the campaign. We thought it was self-evident to people that these little gestures of micro-level development were not going to transform their lives, but we were wrong. And I think very clearly the state of shock the Congress went into after its defeat, it still hasn't fully recovered from. But when it does, and there are still 4.5 years to go for the next election, I think it will have a chance to reassert the timeless values on which India has been built, the values that I talked about, the ground rules on which our democracy is meant to flourish, and the genuine faith in both liberalizing our economy and redistributive social justice that have animated our policies. So I remain an optimist in the sense, a pessimist believes everything is bound to go wrong. An optimist is one, I think, who believes in uncertainty. That is, who believes that if we do some things right and we work hard enough and get our act together, then a happy outcome could happen. That's my definition of optimism. I'll stick to that for now.
Very good. Okay, well, some limited and qualified optimism on which to end. That was a fantastic tableau of the region, globalization, identity. I'd like you to give my panelists one last hearty round of applause, and thank you to all of you for coming.